Cool. We affirm resolve the U.S. should end its economic sanctions against Venezuela. Our first contention is the Venezuelan crisis. U.S. sanctions on Venezuela contributed to the sufferings of millions in 3 ways. First, by preventing policy reform. As Venezuela faced a potential economic slump, U.S. sanctions prevented the government from correcting course to avoid a recession. As Wismore of The Nation in 2017 writes that at the start of the downturn, Venezuela was on track to reform key debt practices and the economy to avoid an economic crisis. However, the imposition of sanctions cut the country off from investment in the international market, making it impossible for the country to roll over its debt and thus pushing Venezuela towards a crisis. Indeed, Heartland furthers in 2019 that since 2014, sanctions have degraded Venezuela's reputation on the international market, causing numerous financial institutions to turn away from investing in Venezuelan debt. Overall, Sachs of the CPR in 2019 finds that the imposition of sanctions made any stabilization program to solve the currency and import problem impossible, as Venezuela was increasingly shut off from major markets in the dollar, locking Venezuela into an economic spiral that has caused millions to flee and live under oppressive conditions. Second is by shocking the oil industry. Zunga of Financial Times in 2019 writes that Venezuela used to mix their heavy crude with an American chemical called naphtha, making it easier for oil to move and sell to other markets. With sanctions, Venezuela has lost access to this chemical and resorted to cheaper, worse quality blends such as Mary 16. As a result, the oil Venezuela now sells at $17 less profitable than before. Even besides the physical quality of oil, Stratford 19 writes that tanker companies and countries are wary of signing contracts for Venezuelan oil under the threat of U.S. sanctions and backlash. As a result, Venezuelan oil production and profits have dropped. Empirically, Bean of the CPR in 2019 finds that after a gradual decline in Venezuela oil production, output dropped by 142,000 barrels following the introduction of U.S. oil sanctions. Crashing Venezuelan oil sales has been devastating for the country, as Rodriguez of Foreign Policy in 2018 writes that since 95% of export revenues from Venezuela comes from oil, sanctions cut off the government's main source of dollars and thus the way to finance food and medicine. Indeed, despite increases in oil prices, Venezuelan imports still fell by 31%, and in the 2 months following new sanctions, food imports fell by additional 24%. Peraz of Think Progress in 2019 concludes that as time goes on, sanctions will only kill more and more people and cause millions to flee into mass exodus, and Rodriguez concludes that sanctions risk turning the crisis into a full-blown humanitarian catastrophe. Third, by blocking direct aid shipments. Although calibrated to allow aid access to Venezuela and financial interactions with internal NGOs, U.S. sanctions often impede important work in 2 ways. First, through blocking outside aid. As Salama of the Wall Street Journal in 2019 writes that the Trump administration has been very poor in delineating financial lines to allow for aid to flow through, oftentimes unintentionally blocking things such as food and medicine. Second, through the blocking of support for internal organizations. As Tokar 19 further said, U.S. banks have been unwilling to finance humanitarian organizations, fearing fines for skirting U.S. sanctions. He concludes that although the U.S. has given exceptions to certain NGOs, the risk of punishment has left many smaller nonprofits within Venezuela at risk of shutdown. These NGOs and aid packages are critical, as Fox at DW in 2019 writes that 300,000 people are at risk of serious health complications because sanctions have choked off medical supplies. Our second contention is ending Trump's re-election chances. For Trump to win re-election, he must win Florida. As David of the Miami Herald in 2019 writes that because Democrats have regained their footing in the Rust Belt, Trump must win Florida in order to win the Electoral College. Ending sanctions on Venezuela would give Florida to the Democrats, as USA Today in 2019 writes that Trump's tough stance on Venezuela has been extremely popular in Florida among the Cuban, Colombian, and Venezuelan populations, a group of more than 1.5 million voters, concluding that because Florida is so competitive, any shift in these votes can move Florida to either column. Forcing Trump out of office is critical for poverty reduction, as CBS in 2019 writes that Trump's executive orders would push 3 million people off food assistance, and Fox writes that nearly all Democratic candidates have extensive plans to reduce climate change by reducing carbon emissions. This is key, as the PRI in 2019 writes that American leadership is key to reducing emissions globally by half, and the National Research Council quantifies that just a 1 degree Celsius increase will reduce crop yields by 15%, compromising lives of 2.5 billion people worldwide that are dependent on the agriculture. Thus, we are proud to affirm. Okay. I'm going to be a tiny bit faster. Is everyone ready?
No, I'm sorry. Hold up, yeah. Okay, I'm ready.
Perfect. We all good? Okay.
All right, go for it.
Time
We'll start now. We negate. Contention 1 is Maduro. Lafrenchi 19 explains the Venezuelan sanctions are the first of their kind, an unprecedented weapon to force a surrender already. Rendon 19 finds that an economic sanctions from the U.S. are weakening Maduro's power, bringing him to negotiations. Sanctions spark regime change in 4 ways. First, by cutting CLAP. Spirig 19 explains that CLAP is a food subsidy program Maduro uses to levy food support, preventing opposition. Luckily, the U.S. sanctions target 90% of CLAP subsidies, creating extreme vulnerability to regime change. Lifting sanctions allows the program to survive. Second is by ending the gold rush. Delago 19 explains Maduro has turned to selling gold in order to create a direct revenue stream that is allowing him to still maintain power. Luckily, Woroff 19 finds the U.S. sanctions choke out Venezuela's gold industry, and Correa 19 furthers that because U.S. sanctions have prevented Venezuela from buying imports in cash, Maduro pays in gold, depleting reserves by 18.5% in less than a year. Lifting sanctions saves the gold revenue stream. Third is by creating leverage. Anderson 18 finds the U.S. has imposed economic sanctions on Venezuelan officials, even Maduro himself. The U.S. Treasury Department 19 furthers that the U.S. is using sanctions against military generals to create incentives for opposing Maduro. For example, Frazen 19 finds that sanctions turn the general of Venezuela's National Intelligence Service against Maduro. Overall, Rendon 19 finds that sanctions are creating the necessary leverage to restore Venezuela's democracy. Lifting sanctions eliminates that leverage. Fourth is by landing the knockout. Starfer 19 finds that while Venezuela was facing economic distress for years, U.S. sanctions make any contact with Venezuelan state-owned companies illegal. Even Russian firms are decreasing their imports of Venezuelan oil, and Kasari 19 furthers that Chinese companies are pulling support right now. Starfer concludes that while Maduro was previously able to give favorable treatment to political allies, U.S. sanctions have blunted government oil revenue enough to make Maduro supporters feel the effects of the current crisis. Lifting sanctions allows Maduro to remain in enough oil of revenue to keep political and military allies on his side. Negating is key. Starfer finds that soon military forces will experience food shortages, soldiers will go unpaid, and challengers will rise. For these 4 reasons, Starfer concludes that U.S. sanctions are making it so Maduro's exit is on the horizon. The longer we have economic sanctions, the higher the chance he's gone. Rendon furthers that lifting sanctions wouldn't save the economy, only strengthen Maduro and reverse progress. The impact is saving Latin America. Held 19 finds that 6.8 million people are currently on the brink of starvation, and it's only getting worse. Luckily, Sigmora 19 finds that Venezuelan opposition is already in talks with Western institutions. And Malkoff 17 finds that Venezuelan engagement with financial institutions would lead to monetary support and economic recovery. Absent a shift, Venezuela will crack. Daniels 19 explains that if political opposition thinks current oppositions are closed, they will turn to an armed struggle. Pearl 17 quantifies that a civil war in Venezuela would create another Syria, killing millions. The effects are regional. JNS 19 finds that Maduro is a sponsor of terrorist groups such as ELN and FARC. And Palik 19 explains that Venezuelan sponsors Hezbollah, a terrorist group whose grown in Latin America, risks WMD attacks. Gurik 19 furthers that Maduro provides safe havens for Iranian-backed terrorist groups looking for a way into the region. The Associated Press 18 quantifies that attacks by terrorist guerrilla groups killed 460,000 people in Colombia alone. And FERC concludes that Venezuelan support of terrorist groups risks the exchange of nuclear material and development of nuclear weapons. Even if sanctions don't work, their message is key. Basora 17 finds that U.S. democracy promotion strategy in Venezuela is key to send a signal of challenging threats to the global liberal order. Absent the push for Venezuelan democracy, authoritarianism will grow as disincentives to war lower. To end sanctions is to ignore an existential threat. Harari 18 furthers that liberal order is the only way to create enough interstate trust and cooperation to prevent tech disruption, arms race, and nuclear war. Contention 2 is invasion. Absent sanctions, the U.S. will still focus on Venezuela, as Roche 19 finds that the U.S. wants influence over Venezuelan oil supplies, and McCarthy 19 reports that hardline policy on Venezuela is necessary for Trump to receive key voters among Hispanic groups. Sanctions are key to preventing military action. Gilsman 19 finds that any further step on Venezuela would involve military forces, and Galeto 19 explains that sanctions replace the military option. Green 19 furthers that U.S. uses sanctions to fulfill foreign policy objectives in Venezuela as a replacement for an invasion. O'Neill 18 finds that U.S. invasion would bolster Maduro's claim of U.S. imperialism, which militarization and state size, making an intervention comparable to that of Iraq. Fannin quantifies that a U.S.-Venezuelan conflict would kill 2 million people. Armstrong 19 furthers that Russia would enter, backing Venezuela similar to the Syrian conflict, and because this causes miscalculation between the U.S. and Russia, Star 15 concludes that this will cause a nuclear extinction from thermonuclear war. First speaking team, you can have the first question.
Okay, you good?
Yep.
All right. So let's talk about these terrorism groups you talked about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So where are they operating?
I can give you multiple as we read.
Or just like the general group, like
the
in
general
region, right?
In the region, yeah.
Okay, so like what, like Brazil, Paraguay, like surrounding countries, or?
The 460,000 deaths were caused by Colombia terrorist groups.
So is that like FARC, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so like is FARC's sole funding source Maduro? Like,
that's one of their major funding sources, yeah.
okay, so I'm kind of confused, right? Because your first part is that Venezuela is like losing their money, but then your second part is that like they're funding this.
Right, so what Maduro does with the little money he has left is give it to terrorist groups and prisoner groups that can continue to prop up the Maduro regime. You just asked the questions, I'm gonna ask
do you mind if I like clarify something? So like,
sure, yeah.
How are the terrorist groups like propping up Maduro?
They're fighting against people that don't support Maduro and causing terror in the region, which stops other people from coming in and militarily intervening and stopping Venezuela, Maduro himself. But I'm going to take a question.
Sure.
So let's talk about shocking the oil industry.
Yeah.
Right? Wasn't oil prices and oil imports, exports from Venezuela going down prior to U.S. sanctions?
No.
No, they weren't decreasing the amount of oil they were selling.
Even if that's true, we say that there was a pretty marked decrease as a result of the sanctions happening. I mean, it's pretty obvious. There was an
But there was a
embargo,
trend
US was
of decreasing the amount of oil they sold
I mean,
prior to sanctions.
that's fine. So what was the trend? Like,
Going down. They were
like
selling
how
less
much?
and less
How
oil.
much? How much?
We can provide you that statistic in
And
rebuttal.
why, like, what's the time frame? Like, how long was it decreasing for?
Probably like pretty long. We were seeing that
That's
within the entire
not true,
region.
right? Like Venezuela was actually pumping more oil out. Their production was up. Even if there's a short-term trend, the fact that the United States was the biggest buyer of Venezuelan oil indicates that as a result of the embargo, there was a dramatic decrease in the amount of like oil being sold.
Sure, we both have oil links. You can have a question.
Okay, so let's talk about like this third link about creating leverage, right?
Mhm.
So you say he's like using sanctions to create like what's he using?
He's using individual sanctions on things like military officials, which
Okay.
basically
Yeah.
state if you want to turn against Maduro, we
So-
will remove the sanctions.
So how many officials have like turned over?
We give you one really important empiric. We can also give you cards which indicate other people that have switched, but specifically
so,
we
like-
talk about the general of Venezuela's National Intelligence Service.
That's fine. Like I mean, the general was replaced, but I'm talking about like let's say like generically, right? How many military people have actually turned over?
I can't give you that number.
So like only like 1,000, right? Compared to like a military.
we're
a couple
getting the 1,000
100,000
number.
from like an evidence. Like,
Okay, even if it is 1,000, if we're talking about high-level military personnel, that's probably pretty good.
well, it's out of the
sanctions
entire military of like 300,000, right?
300,000.
Like I'm trying to get some kind of scope of like how many people are actually defecting, because there's like always people, someone like
Right,
defecting
but we
all
can
the
both
time,
agree
right?
that sanctions are causing people to turn against Maduro in Venezuela.
Well, I mean, I'm not necessarily agreeing to that. I'm asking for like.
Well, you just said
some
1,000
statistics.
people did.
No, I'm not saying that's because of sanctions. I'm just saying that generically 1,000 people have left. But like
Wait,
I'm asking,
what is
I'm
the
asking
context?
for like.
What is that 1,000 number about?
Sure, it's just saying like in the past year or whatever, 1,000 people have left. But I'm asking
Due to
because
what?
well, do you mind if I like ask a question again? So the question is, right, is that people are always defecting from the military for regardless reasons, right? How many people are uniquely now leaving the military because of the sanctions?
I mean, it sounds like 1,000, but like I'm sure we can provide you empirics on that.
Sure.
Period.
On their second contention, their first response comes from the TSS finds that in order to prove this legislation, it has to go to the House of Congress, and the TSS evidence says that Congress is never going to approve invading Venezuela. So it means even if Trump has an incentive to invade in the first place, the Congress is going to reject it. But number two, we said that the United States says that Trump has a broader incentive to not intervene in Venezuela. He ran on the idea of not getting the United States involved in other countries' conflicts. They might say that he might want to appease the Florida constituency, but we say in order to appeal to his broader base, he's not going to intervene, which is more important because it's more important than just one state. His entire base does not want to intervene. He's more likely not to intervene. But lastly, I think progress evidence says that as sanctions go into Venezuela and creates more of a humanitarian crisis and more people leave the country, that increases incentive for there to be some sort of intervention because now there's international pressure for the United States to intervene into a conflict that they started in the first place and a crisis that they started in the first place. So the real risk of intervention and the real risk of Congress approving something like this is that Venezuela actually goes into a humanitarian crisis. Now let's go to the top of their first contention. The first response comes from the Bolson Center, who finds that even though sanctions are reducing Maduro's finances, he's always able to find back holes and he's always able to use U.S. sanctions as a scapegoat. He's able to paint the current economic situation within Venezuela as like the reason as to why U.S. sanctions are bad and the reason as to why U.S. intervention is a bad thing. He's able to increase anti-American sentiment, which is why overall he's been able to hold on to power. We've had sanctions since 2014. The best thing that's happened to 1,000 Venezuelan soldiers have defected. There's been no long-term like moves towards any sort of negotiations or any sort of tangible change. They might come up and say they're coming to negotiations right now, but call for their evidence. The evidence just says the negotiations are happening. It does not say that number one, the negotiations are going to succeed. They've gone to negotiations before in Barbados, but Maduro just used them as a way to buy time. In the long term, they did not succeed. The second response here is that is not doing the comparative analysis. What NACLA finds is that even if Maduro gets out of power, Juan Guaido, the opposition party that the United States is trying to prop up as the next president, is terrible for Venezuela. His ideologies and his policies of privatization and things like increasing the private sector involvement within Venezuela are terrible to the point where they conclude that the new policies are just going to concentrate wealth at the top and leave the normal Venezuelan poorer off. Which is why they conclude that the new president won't actually be good for Venezuela when it's told to say the same, where millions of people are in poverty. But let's go to their specific links. The first link they say is that we're cutting off this food program. Number one, they don't read as why this food program is actually crucial for Maduro. Just saying that this food program exists does not necessarily mean that Maduro is using it as a way to keep his regime strong. We say that the public doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is the military, because the military is what gives Maduro the power to crack down and crack down on political dissidents. So it doesn't matter if the general public are mad. It matters if the military is propped up. The second thing they say is this gold rush thing. Number one, again, they don't read any evidence that says that cutting off this gold supply is actually good for stopping Maduro in the first place. Just saying he gets less money does not necessarily mean he doesn't have the capability as well to just divert resources forces to still crack down on political dissidents or not do negotiations, which he hasn't done for the last 5 years when we've had sanctions. But number two, Venezuela can just move these gold to the black market, which is what they're doing right now. They're selling to things like Colombia and FARC, so they're still getting other revenue sources. The third thing they say is they're increasing leverage. But again, there hasn't been any significant defections. We've had sanctions since 2014, but recently there's only been 1,000 Venezuelan shores that defective, and they're going to give one example of a general. We say they have to prove a time frame in terms of where their argument is actually triggering. We say the incentive for these people is to stay with Maduro, insofar he's always able to find other revenue sources, which I'll get into later, and always able to divert money, things away from social security programs. He can, as long as he's able to fund the military to its fullest degree, they're always going to stay with him, which is why they've always stayed with him, and they're going to continue to stay with them. But then, let's go to their fourth one. It's just the knockout blow. The problem is with the Wilson Center finds is that Russia and China are too adamant to leave Venezuela aside. There might be short-term fluctuations in terms of how much they buy from Venezuela, but long-term, they're always going to stay good punters. And the reasoning as to why is Russia and China view it as interfering in the United States' spheres of influence, which is why China literally last month, and so is Russia, they're both buying Russian and Chinese oil, which is why they're not going to be any sort of knockout blows, because they're always find other revenue sources. But number two, they also don't prove why they can just do things like decrease aid from other programs and decrease money in other parts of the economy and just divert it to the military. They're not doing the comparative analysis in terms of how much Maduro's power is actually decreasing. But let's go to their nuance. They say it affects overall like democracy promotion. Number one, their countries are more than silly to crash against the United States. You know the United States is the biggest and strongest military and economic power, so they're not going to take this one instance of us removing sanctions as a signal for them to just start doing whatever they want. We say there's been 100 years in the United States on sanctions and using military and economic power against other countries. They know better than to lash against the United States and start a conflict which they know they would lose. There's no incentive for them to any long-term be emboldened to do the things that they talk about. But then on their impact scenario, that's fine. Start on my, wait, are you starting on your case or case? My case, I'm gonna follow. Okay, sorry. Okay, y'all ready? Yeah. Jackson's ready? Yes. Judge is ready. On my case, by their defense, Maduro never gets kicked out of power. That's going to be eternal defense on their case, we're going to implicate it. And go to our impact about modeling. The only response that they make is that the United States military is really big, and the only thing that matters is that's one instance of matter with it. But Source 17 evidence does really clear analysis that the reason this matters is because Russia and China are revisionist powers that are pushing it against the United States, meaning we're talking about Venezuela. They themselves do the comparative analysis of Russia and China are pushing their meaning U.S. sanctions, like imposing, like basically a red light against autocratic waves worldwide. The Bazaar evidence is very explicit. It says that if the United States does not have a democracy promotion strategy in Venezuela, autocratic waves will rise to challenge the liberal world order. They drop the Ferrari evidence that the liberal world order is the only way to establish enough trust and interstate cooperation to prevent things like nuclear war and miscalculation. Then, under second contention, by their analysis that Congress would never pass, we go over to their case. On the top shelf, March 1719 finds that due to failed socialist policy, corruption, and poor government management, Venezuela's economy crashed far before the U.S. ever imposed sanctions, concluding that the media overplays the effect of sanctions. This has two implications. First, it means they never solve for structural problems in Venezuela, meaning they have no long-term resiliency. But second, regime change is the only risk of reversing structural problems, meaning you always go negative on some risk of it if Jackson wants to go for it in summary. But then they talk about this Weisbord evidence. But Adele 19 finds that Weisbord doesn't look like a causality. His methodology is flawed, and all the harms that he concludes come from sanctions, while inevitable due to all factors that he doesn't consider. The first thing talking about that. First, Adele 19 finds that 4 sanctions states were already decreasing all the flow of credit to Venezuela due to the fact that the rest of Latin America was much more profitable. First, sanctions, Venezuela was essentially unable to restructure debt. But second, trust won't come back as long as Maduro is in power. He's violated human rights and opposes the West and destroy the economy, meaning that literally their own terminal defense, in our case, is terminal defense on theirs. Go to their second contention, or secondly, talking about oil. First, I think 19 finds that you can cross-apply the overview. They found that the oil industry was failing pre-sanctions. Stratford finds that the people were hurt. Finds that while the people were hurt, no matter what sanctions specifically cross the line of eliminating enough revenue, so Maduro can't pay off the military, concluding sanctions will lead to regime change in Venezuela, even though the people are hurt, not unique. But if anything, turn the argument against them. Jim 19 writes that in the long term, Saudi Arabia's dependence on oil will lead to economic and social instability. Luckily, their Vision 2030 diversification plan can be in the mode of oil and prevent collapse. In the short term, however, Hamid 17 finds that Vision 2030 is dependent on high oil prices in order to attract enough revenue to get a higher IPO evaluation. Removing sanctions kills 2030. As popularly resistant 19 finds that U.S. sanctions on Venezuela have restricted global oil supply enough to increase global oil prices 16%. Cross 16 concludes that should Vision 2030 fail, the collapse of the Saudi Arabian state will lead to a power vacuum filled by multiple terrorist organizations that reign influence the global propagate. Pakistan is responsible by international alliances that throw the Middle East into war. Both concludes that Middle Eastern war will go unchecked due to faulty intelligence and command control in escalatory situations, pushing new states to attain nuclear weapons and eventually spark a nuclear war. Then the third thing, talking about the NGO. First, we'd argue that they would still fear the U.S. ally sanctioning the United States coming back and sanctioning, especially considering that Trump is incredibly volatile. Second, we'd argue Maduro will always make sure that the aid either goes to the government or only goes to his supporters. They drop the analysis on our climate impact that Maduro redirects all funding over to his supporters and his military generators, meaning aid never gets to the people. Third, we'd argue the NGOs are afraid of Maduro, will always stay away. They're afraid of what Maduro will do, especially considering that socialist policy, state socializes all actors to trying to enter the region, but the fourth medicine is decreasing. Is like their whole argument talking about 300,000 people is not unique. I look at 19,000 medical imports dropped 71% before sanctions due to failed domestic policy, and they don't read another impact. Then the 3 million statistic on Trump. Go to Trump. The 3 million statistic should be not unique due to Republican-controlled Senate, but they don't give you a reason the president is key. But then Trump is good. Trump's key to Afghan stability. Burgers 17 expanded Trump policy regarding terrorism in the Middle East is defeated ISIS through smarter and more efficient counter-terror measures. He expanded that policy to combat Afghan terror. Also, 17 concludes that Afghan terror and instability risk civil war through social splits leading to spillover effects into Central Asia. While Moscow 14 further that Central Asia is a key geopolitical center of trade flows with instability, having the risk of war between Russia, China, and the West. According to the further that Afghan terrorists are underway in attempts to target Pakistani military officials and spark nuclear war between India and Pakistan. Then on climate change. Turn it. Climate change prevents an ice age. Tomorrow, 04 explains that there's another climate ice age will occur with no warning, and I'll have a transition period of a couple years. China finds that this will happen in 2027. It will wipe our humanity worse than any predicted model of climate change locally. While 12 finds that the release of greenhouse gases warms climate and prevents the ice age with Ultra 5 concludes that current carbon reserves could have built only gaseous for 130,000 years. Then, turn it. Climate change prevents starvation. March 17 rise of population growth, make food demand, outlays food production, spark mass famines as we literally run out of food. Sure, fact concludes that demand, which over high CO2 concentration, the rich go for 95% of the world's plant needs. Also, to further that higher carbon allows for food to grow more efficiently using less land and water. Concludes this will allow us to not be all resources needed for human survival. Sure, concludes that absent cutbacks and emissions will be prevented, even if they get warned by decreasing food production. Believe the team that cleared analysis using the past 30 years of data found that increasing CO2 emissions actually increases net plant growth by 31%. Yeah, so did you get the framing at the bottom? So you can just
Yeah, the framing.
Where did you stop? Just after the turn, right?
yeah, I didn't read productivity 14%. I got the 31%.
Okay,
stuff
alright.
though. I'll take a breath down. Yo, you're someone.
Go. Oh, yeah. Wait, I feel like, no, it's right. No. Oh, fuck, I'm close. Sorry, we switched.
No, yeah.
I was like,
I was a
wait,
little
wait.
confused when you came up for construction.
Yeah.
I was like, okay.
Okay.
Alright,
You can have the first question, of course.
Just start whenever you want. Yeah. So you say that. So can you explain me like the Venezuela is like key to like autocratic things, like waves?
Yeah, so revisionist powers like Russia and China are pushing against the United States. They want to create autocratic waves to destroy the liberal world order. We tell you that Venezuela is an incredibly important and centralized point because that's where the U.S., Russia, and China are centralized.
So
the Missouri 17 evidence says
Yeah.
that
So what's the
U.S.
impact? What's the impact?
nuclear war.
Okay, so if the warrant I make is that countries know the United States has such incredible military power that they're never going to trigger nuclear war in the first place, then why does it
Obviously,
matter?
they're never going to go to war with the United States. Our argument is about arms races, nuclear proliferation.
So why does
versus
nuclear
miscount.
proliferation lead to war?
Miscount. I said it.
So just saying the word miscalc does not mean war happens. Like miscalculation between who? What type of miscalculation? In what place? In what
Well,
places?
I mean, we gave the miscalculation warrant actually on our Russia analysis, and since I don't need to extend in rebuttal, Jackson's actually gonna like
No.
allow that analysis.
So
but the way that we explain miscalculation with nuclear arms races is that when two states are both developing nukes,
Yeah.
they're gonna think the other state's developing nukes.
So why
will attack
hasn't
them.
miscalculation happened yet?
Because the NPT has restricted all global
No,
development.
that
of nukes
isn't.
by
So why
85%.
hasn't miscalculation happened in India and Pakistan?
Because
They're not following the
nukes.
NPT. And if your link is miscalculations happening because countries don't follow the NPT, then
Well,
why
that's
hasn't?
because both of them have like outdated military systems.
No,
right?
no, they
India's-
don't.
no,
Dude,
it is.
It does not
India's-
take that much work for India to launch a nuke like 30 miles to the west and hit the
No,
war.
but the issue
Like-
is both of them are aware of the fact that they wouldn't sustain themselves in a war, and they know the
Oh,
other
exactly.
one
So
knows
that's
that
the
as well.
war. That's the why where no one would ever go to nuclear war
Well,
because they know they never can sustain
well, no,
themselves.
India and Pakistan are not every single.
So then,
country
what's your
in the war.
impact? So what's your impact? Because like
Nuclear
all
war. What? It's
okay,
it's
no, you
nuclear
can't.
war outside of just India and Pakistan.
No,
Those
but
are the only two countries.
But
in
I
the
can't.
world.
It's impossible for me to respond to an argument when you say, "Hey, look, every single country in the world has a nukes. That's it. Miscalculation, nuke war. Every single
Well,
one
no,
of them's gonna
not
kill
every
each other."
country in the world has nukes.
So then, which
The liberal-
countries? Then it's like,
I don't
how
know.
do I respond
I don't know.
to
The
this?
liberal world order prevented nuclearization in the entirety of the southern hemisphere.
It didn't prevent nuclearization.
It actually, if you want, we can get you that evidence.
Dude,
as well.
let's clear this up. Number one, the liberal order did not prevent nuclearization. Number two, the liberal order did not prevent arms races
since the
either.
Cold War went down 85%.
Yeah, that's between like the United States and Russia.
Nope.
But other countries
Give me a
don't have
country in the
NPT.
southern hemisphere that has nukes.
It's in the southern hemisphere that
A
has
single
nukes.
country in the southern hemisphere that has nukes.
Uh,
You know what's the problem?
Wait,
None of them have nukes because
depends
they're
on
all
like.
signatures to liberal
Yeah,
world order
yeah.
and PT
Okay.
signings. So it depends on like I'm forgetting whether equator is and what countries are in that part, but that doesn't matter, right?
It's
But the
right
argument,
near
the
Ecuador,
argument,
right on
the
the
argument, the
Ecuador.
argument I make, and you can't come up and read this MPT analysis because that wasn't made in your constructed.
No,
All
yeah, because that would be a front line to a response you didn't make in rebuttal.
No, and the response I made in rebuttal is that no one's gonna lash out because they know the United States like has a lot of alliances and has an economic and military clout, so they're never gonna be able to backlash against other countries.
The U.S. being powerful and having allies is the liberal world order. If states feel as though the liberal
So,
world
and I'm
order
saying,
is dead,
and
that
Alex,
checks
what I'm
your
saying,
argument.
is that just saying
I'm
that
aware of
Venezuela.
what you're saying. I
And
don't think you're understanding what I'm saying.
I know, but your argument is just that they're going to go to war. I'm saying that just because we remove sanctions of Venezuela doesn't mean that the main deterrent, the thing that's preventing countries and actual nuclear weapons, not just because the United States has friends, is what's going to stop the war from happening.
Cool. They dropped the turn about a humanitarian crisis. What our big progress evidence indicates is that the only way a U.S. intervention would happen is if the situation gets even worse and becomes a humanitarian crisis. We say sanctions actually make the problem worse and encourage massive exodus of refugees. The reason why this is important is because their concession that an intervention will not happen doesn't respond to the big progress evidence that says that as the situation gets worse and turns into a humanitarian crisis, then it becomes where the public support for an intervention increases. Meaning that even if they say that right now there's no intervention possible, we agree, but in a world where we have sanctions happening and causing a humanitarian crisis, then we have an intervention happen. That links into their power vacuum impact because if the United States intervenes in the area and causes a power vacuum, that creates the incentive for other actors to come into the area and creates a global war linking the exact same impact. Then let's go to the liberal order. They say that Russia and China were vicious powers are going to cause war to happen. They basically understand what a Trey says. Trey says that our arguments about miscalculation will happen because we have so much clout and international alliances and our military is so strong and there's no incentive for countries to start launching nukes as soon as we leave the region. For example, that's why India and Pakistan aren't doing anything even though they both have nuclear weapons. There's no war happening because the United States and other actors throughout the entire world are willing to intervene regardless of whether order exists or not. But the second thing here is the example of the Cold War. We say no miscalculation happened in the Cold War because everyone had nuclear weapons. There was no liberal order back then about the Western world. It was very united. There was a bipolar world. That means that the liberal order isn't necessarily key for maintaining the order as long as other people have nukes. They'll always make sure that no one else actually uses nukes in order to cause war. This argument makes absolutely no sense. Then let's go to our case. On our subpoint B about shaking off the oil industry, he reads a giant disadvantage about Saudi Arabia diversifying. Number one, we say Saudi Arabia controls OPEC, meaning that if they want to raise the prices in order to access diversification impact, they can just tell OPEC to reduce supply and allow for prices to rise, meaning that Saudi Arabia can make more money off it. It's not really unique to the fact that we need Venezuela to sanction their argument. But second, what the foreign policy evidence writes is that Saudi Arabia is facing massive expansion in multiple sectors that are key to devices for diversification, for example, in 5G and other telecommunication industries that are going to diversify the industry regardless. We say, as a result of this influx of investment, we don't even need the oil in order to pay for it. It's already coming in. Then let's go to HM. They give a couple responses. First thing they say is that the United States allies are going to still punish them. We say NGOs won't work without the United States. In fact, they specifically depend on U.S. banks, meaning this is a response that they need the money and cooperation from financial banks. The second thing they say is that aid is always going to be bought by Maduro. We say it's not about aid. Our second thing is about NGOs going in and helping people in the region, helping them with their medical affairs and giving them medical supplies. So even if Maduro doesn't do anything, he's not going to do anything. But the second thing they say is that NGOs are afraid of Maduro. No, because these are Venezuelan NGOs inside of Venezuela. They're not outside organizations that fear Maduro. They're already part of Venezuela. That's what the NGOs are, meaning that they obviously don't fear Maduro. They've already been operating in it. Meaning if this response was also true, then they shouldn't have been operating before sanctions, then Maduro should have shut them down as well. Then they say that medicine's not unique. No, we say NGOs are key because insofar as sanctions came in place in 2014, even their uniqueness about sanctions in medicine applies decreasing before that. It doesn't matter. We still see 300,000 people that need to be saved. That's a DW evidence. Then on Trump re-election, first of all, we'll concede that the Senate controls policy, so we can't even see any happening. That means they don't get access to their climate change policy turns because there's no climate change policy that's going to be passed. But second, on their terrorism turn about Afghanistan, we say that this return doesn't make sense because any president, regardless of Democrat or Republican, would engage in the exact same policies. In fact, Obama was doing the type of OCOs that they talk about in their evidence, meaning that any president would be accessing the offense they're getting off of the Afghanistan turn.
We'll start now. Start in our case. Persona 1917 explains that U.S. democracy promotion strategy in Venezuela is key to send a signal of challenging threats to the global liberal world order. Absent the push for Venezuelan democracy, authoritarianism will continue to grow as disincentives to war lower. To end sanctions to ignore an existential threat, Harari 18 finds that the liberal world order is the only way to create enough interstate trust and cooperation to prevent tech disruption, arms races, and nuclear war, which Sachs explains would ultimately develop into a scenario which could cause extinction. Let's go to the responses they read. First, they say India and Pakistan are disincentivized from going to war right now. We would argue that's because the liberal world order is intact right now. However, once we remove sanctions and countries like Russia and China start to raise up and go against the United States world order, that is when we start to see nuclear proliferation and arms races develop. Second, they say there was no miscalc in the Cold War instance. First, they would say that's because there were two very powerful states that were all controlling the majority of the power. However, in our scenario, we're talking about multiple less powerful states developing nuclear arsenals which don't have the ability to create enough sufficient security systems to establish those nukes don't get used. Also, it was brand new in summary. Don't evaluate that response. With that, let's go to our contention to on invasion. All they say is that as the U.S. situation situation continues to get worse and their economy continues to go into a spiral, it's going to increase the probability that we actually invade them. Here's the issue with that. Their card is citing lies, bro. But what Alka 19 explains is that the methodology of that card is incredibly horrible. It didn't isolate for causality and all the harms are due to all factors. Don't buy their evidence at all. Go to the top of their case. Extend all of the pieces of defense Alec reads as to why we're going to continuously be seeing Venezuela's economy get horrible as we go into the future. With that, let's go on to their case. On the bottom, we read, actually on NGOs, extend a few things. First, NGOs cannot function without money and or medicine. Then extend the analysis that we saw a 71% decrease in the amount of medication that they had prior to sanctions. That means we're on the NGO link on their second link on their third link, second warrant. They say NGOs are key and they can continue to go in. We say medicine is not, and medicine is what NGOs need to be able to function in the region and cause their impacts. They don't have that due to the economic decline that was happening prior to sanctions. On their contention too, they say the Republican Congress wouldn't pass a bill, thus we're not going to be actually countering climate change. Their cards are talking about an American-led presence. That American presence won't be there if Trump is re-elected to office. With that, let's continue to extend the terms that we read on the bottom of their case. Turn. Climate change prevents starvation. Martin 17 writes that population growth will make food demand and outpace food production, sparking mass famines as we literally run out of food. Sherwood 05 furthers that while demand will triple, higher CO2 concentrations enrich growth for 95% of the world's plants' food need. ISDO 02 furthers that higher carbon allows for food growth more efficiently at using less water and less land, concluding that this will allow us to not deplete all resources needed for human survival. Sherwood concludes that absent cutbacks, current emissions will help overcome the upcoming famine. Even if they weren't, why warming decreases food production? Ridley 13 does the comparative analysis using the past 30 years of data, finding that increasing CO2 concentrations by 0.1% of the air increases net plant growth by 31%. This goes functionally conceded. They don't respond to this. You're going to be voting very clearly here. Insofar as don't respond to it. We get clear access to that terminal impact. You're going to be voting for us on either modeling or the terms or the fact that they just don't have a case.
I don't know. Done.
Can we starting off an intervention, same way, like intervention, then the first mention, then our case. Is everyone good? Start our second contention of intervention. The only response, which is new in second summary, just says that the visor evidence is bad, but call for the evidence. They're like literally citing some other visor evidence. The visor evidence, a weak part, just says that if there is more of a humanitarian crisis, then there's going to be more of a need to actually intervene, and there's more of a pressure to intervene in the first place. It's not irrelevant of whether or not the economic analysis he's doing. The warranting is pretty clear that if there's more of a humanitarian crisis, there's more of an incentive for Congress to approve there to be an intervention within Venezuela. And this is key because they themselves read an impact that says if the United States intervenes and it creates a power vacuum which leads to extinction. We say this is the biggest impact, number one, just on scope, because if we say that if we prioritize extinction, it doesn't matter if there's climate change, it doesn't matter if there's crops, it doesn't matter if there's a little bit of nuclear war between both countries. We see the biggest impact is when big countries get involved in nuclear war, and that prevents extinction. That's the biggest impact in today's round. But then let's go on their like modeling argument. They say that if the liberal order goes away, then there's going to be more like nuclear weapons between smaller countries. They don't respond to the inherent warranty which we tell you. It says the reasons why nuclear war does not happen is because both countries have nuclear weapons. It's an incentive for both countries never to go to nuclear war. It doesn't matter if they both are developing at the same time. The incentive is true. If India or Pakistan or whoever, two developing countries get nuclear weapons, they're not going to attack each other if they know they're going to get both nuked. That's the reason. That's why there's going to be no mutually assured destruction. They're even extended warranting as to why miscalculation overwhelms mutually assured destruction. We say mutually assured destruction is preventing nuclear war for a very long time. But number two, it's not even contingent on the fact that the liberal order goes away. Is this the fact that developing world countries and countries in general, like the United States, has a lot of alliances? So if they attack one country, they're probably pulling in the same other actors. In fact, their own impact does the warranting for us on their second contention. That when one country gets involved, other countries get involved. That's the disincentive to go to war in the first place. Now let's go back to our case on the NGO stuff. They say that it's been decreased by 71% before, but the DW evidence is specific saying that because of sanctions, it decreased by 300,000%, and the warranting is clear from the Takaro evidence because these financial institutions are not willing to work with the United States the NGOs within Venezuela because financial institutions are not incentivized to actually get involved. It's also, again, this is the link into the weighing of their second contention. But then on the very bottom, they say that they tell for climate change, but the Vox evidence says that the reason as to why some climate change is going to decrease is because all the Democratic presidents have had big policy changes. Just having a president does not necessarily lead to actually tangible climate change policy. The impact they're accessing on mitigating climate change is so minimal. They're just saying that the presence is good. They don't contextualize how much of our presence actually decreases climate change. We say the only world where climate change actually decreases to a substantial degree is if we actually have someone who is actually passing policy in the first place. The presence is probably key to some degree, but it's just made such a marginal impact. Things like extinction and the 300,000 and stopping the humanitarian crisis of Venezuela are more important impacts versus an untermized, unweighed, and unquantified climate change argument.
this round is a lot simpler than it seems. They dropped the defense at the top of their case that a continual downward trend on the Venezuelan economy is inevitable. They tell you it's scalar and it gets worse, but no, the analysis we made is the downward trend happens no matter what because of failing domestic policy and the failing ability for the government to act. And that is why there was a 71% drop in medical imports before we ever even imposed sanctions. That is critical for two reasons. First, because their impact is talking about people getting access to medicine, the 300,000 people. But it doesn't matter if NGOs have access or don't have access to the financial system if there's no medicine. Because guess what? The medicine went away before we even had sanctions. That was dropped analysis. But also, remember, at the end of the day, the downward trial non-uniques, their link evidence on our C2 talking about invasion, meaning at the end of the day, extinction is inevitable at that point. You might as well just default neg because no other presumption argument has been made. And then go to their second contention. They make a brand new response in Final Focus saying it's like super minimal and we don't make an analysis. The thing is this was their link and we conceded it in second rebuttal. When their own link tells you there's a 50% cut in global emissions because the shift in US leadership pushes people to combat climate change. So at that point he said all the analysis that higher CO2 concentrations are incredibly good because they enrich Planck. You can study Sherwood uniqueness evidence that if this does and that if absent cutbacks increase CO2 emissions are enough to prevent massive amounts of famines which are going to cause human extinction in the future. Meaning this is a much cleaner extinction lane, so you can literally vote here and click stop round, go over to our case. On our second contention, talking about intervention. Here's the thing. Their evidence is talking about Wisebro. Check the email I sent. We read the Wisebro indictment in rebuttal. So at that point, extend the Aldeca 19 evidence after Wisebro evidence doesn't isolate for causality. The methodology is incredibly flawed, and all of the things they talk about are due to all factors that happen independent of sanctions. And then extend the Pozzari evidence that says that the U.S. the market coalition strategy of Venezuela is incredibly crucial to create the balance shift between Russia and China. They give you all these reasons that it's really good right now, but all of those are tied back to the liberal world order. We tell you that leads to accidental launches and miscalculation between smaller states, which then causes nuclear war and extinction. Smaller states was dropped.